to detect whether risks exist, but also to scale the risks to determine whether action's necessary. And one other thing I'll mention, and biology is full of things that make your life more difficult. In this case, one thing we observed last year, in addition to the constant low-level abundance or density of fish at Jersey Point, was that there was a huge effect of weather there. And whenever there was a storm or even a really cloudy sky, the catch momentarily went up. So you'll notice we have a few days during that period where we had really large catches at that location. That seems to be related to response of the fish to weather conditions that existed on those days. And if you look on either side of it, it does not appear to be an indication the fish are moving. So that's one more thing we'll have to factor in evaluating these data going forward. And that's all
Interesting.
That's all I had to say for this portion of the talk. But I would like to also say that the Fish and Wildlife Service's stewardship mission extends beyond just dealing with water operations. And we've limited this presentation to fish issues in the delta and upstream, but we also have been evaluating effects of the drought on the refuge system in the Central Valley. And that investigation is also an ongoing thing. I think it would be safe to summarize at this point to say that south of Delta refuges were much more strongly affected than north of Delta refuges. The water was more limited down there. They got 65% of their level 2 allocation. Mm-hmm. Because the water was limited, there were a number of refuges where they had to abandon summer irrigation, and there were some refuges that didn't get any irrigation at all, both north and south of Delta. And the results of that are still being evaluated, but the affected refuges had less food available for migratory birds. They had there are probably some other animal effects that haven't been evaluated yet. The non-irrigated wetland units also were colonized during the year by upland vegetation, and it's going to take some time to manage some of those areas back to being in a wetland status when the drought ends. We also had some changes in hatchery operations that I won't get into that were well publicized, that were a result of the water in the main stem Sacramento being too warm for the fish to be released, in some cases directly from the hatchery. We'd be interested in coming back and briefing the board again on refuge issues and updates on
Maybe we should do something specifically on that. That would be good.
Yeah, no, we have experts in our refuge program who could provide more detail. And at this point,
on that, when you come back, I'm particularly interested in the variation in capability of the refuges to actually get water if curtailments are lifted, and what kinds of specialty releases you might be discussing with your colleagues about, for refuges in the future, should we, continue in this drought situation, because it is different from from fish, and it's certainly different from farms and a lot of other areas. So I would definitely appreciate another go at this.
Yeah, we'd be happy to do that.
Yeah, I'm also interested in that last issue you brought up about the hatcheries and the contingency measures that were put into place, and any information you have on the success or the lessons learned of those efforts, because that's a highly engineered solution on 4 wheels or 8 wheels, and it's a risk we take, but I would like to hear how we did and some success stories if possible. Thanks.
I think to that point, you can basically take away that pretty much every hatchery fish was put in a truck and either taken to Rio Vista or farther down into the bay to be released to get away from the low flow conditions, temperature, and predation issues. So
It'd be interesting, the combination of, didn't you barge some of them so they could imprint too early on?
I'm not sure if the barging took place this year because of the low flow, Most of the, pretty much all of the hatchery stock were put in trucks.
Yeah, it was quite a production. There was
Yeah.
it's a long distance from the up valley hatcheries down to the, down all the way down to the
All
estuary.
the more amazing what they do in nature. Yeah.
I have the control. Good morning, Chair Marcus, members of the board. I'll touch
Thank you.
just very briefly on hatchery production as it pertains to Livingston Stone National Fish Hatchery. By the way, I'm Garo Winyup from NOAA Fisheries Service. So for winter run, Livingston Stone National Fish Hatchery, it's a conservation hatchery. We want to make sure that genetically we don't compromise that stock in consideration of the natural population. So there's a limit of no more than 100 fish or 120 fish per year. Split in half would be a maximum of 60 females per year for Livingston Stone brood stock. In anticipation of drought conditions and Shasta Reservoir, we increased that amount to up to 400 for brood year 2014. So I think about 380 were captured. I'm not sure what the split was, male and female. But in August, the update that I had was about 840,000 juveniles sitting at the hatchery, growing, and will be released probably in February. This 840,000 in comparison is about 4 times greater than, in quotes, typical years. And then I'll talk through what we're seeing in nature and the numbers. Where will you aim in this? Maybe I don't have the power.
Yeah, we're having an important moment.
Okay. So we, Carl and I, will be talking about primarily the Sacramento River and American River as it pertains to temperature management. And later on, we'll walk through some of the flow issues and then move down into the Delta. We don't have slides on the American River for temperature, but the NIMS biological opinion requires 65 degrees at Watt Avenue throughout the summer. We also required for reclamation to submit a temperature management plan for the American River for temperature management by May 15th. And in consideration of how the Folsom Reservoir was setting up and not enough water in general and cold water, the proposal was to operate to about 69 degrees, and that's primarily for steelhead rearing. So that's all I'm going to say about American River's steelhead
It's hot.
and temperatures. Yes. So going back up to the Sacramento River for temperature management, primarily for winter run, they spawn. Now the peak spawning, it says here May and June, but the last 3 years they've been coming up a little later and spawning a little later. So it causes problems as far as operations and management of the system, trying to preserve more cold water when there's less available. Egg to fry emergence, simple math is by 80 days, but it depends on temperatures. A little warmer temperature, the 80 goes down a little bit, a little too much, of course they start dying. And then on the heels of winter run come fall run, up the Sacramento River, so we have to balance the needs of winter run and fall run, or at least consider the two species in terms of both temperature management and also flows. Yep, there you go. So this is for
That's helpful.
This is for 2014 brood year, and I'll be jumping around between 2013 brood year that came down in 2014, and also the 2014 brood year, which is spawning, egg incubation, and fry emergence. So the x-axis is dates. Y-axis on the left side is temperatures, degrees Fahrenheit, and that's daily average. And on the right side of the y-axis is percent of the population. So through spawning surveys, you see the shade, purple I guess, that's the spawning. Those are the reds that were constructed. There's no indication in this graph of location from Keswick all the way down to the temperature compliance point at Clear Creek. But with the simple math that I mentioned, about 80 days to emergence, we applied about 6 weeks to egg hatching. So you add 6 weeks and you get the blue. and it should be, you know, exactly the same because we're just applying that math. You add about 5 weeks, and that's when the fry emerged from the reds. We have Keswick water temperatures in the blue line. The difference between Keswick water temperature and Clear Creek temperature compliance point, in the summer, especially in this graph, in the summer, water heats up as it goes downstream. So it's not really representative of what the eggs are feeling down in the gravels. And we'll talk about that a little later. So as you can see, the water temperature coming out of Keswick is fairly stable all the way to middle of September. And you see the green line. The green line is the 56-degree need for winter run egg incubation. So from there, the temperature goes up, and you see the red, orange, let's see, what are the colors here? The yellow, orange, and red line indicating the different degrees of potential adverse effects to mortality of either eggs or alevins still in the gravel. And then you see the shading, corresponding shading of yellow, orange, and red identifies the time frame. So the thickness of the shading is the time frame. So about, I don't know what that is, week and a half, 3 weeks, from 56 to 58, 58 to 60, and then about 5 weeks between 60 and 62 degrees. Beyond 62 degrees is about 100% mortality, and I don't know if it's instantaneous or how many days. Okay, so if we flip that chart sideways, whoop, yeah, that's right. So the red line indicates Keswick or Clear Creek temperature compliance point temperatures. The green is releases at Keswick. Oh, that's the other way around. Red is Keswick, green is Clear Creek. So this is what I was referring to earlier about Keswick being a little cooler, at least in the summer. And then the blue line is at 100%, and that's all the eggs and alevin in the reds. And as time goes on and the alevin emerge from the reds, that line goes down to eventually 0 near the end of October. So you can see how the eggs and alevin are affected by the temperatures going up, especially in the September and October window. So as I was mentioning, turning the earlier slide sideways here, between 56 on the right side is temperatures. So 56 to 58 degrees, approximately 8% mortality. And it's a continuum. It's not once you hit 56.1, we have 8% mortality, but it starts creeping up. So we have 8%, so it just keeps going up. So at the peak of the temperatures at Clear Creek, near the beginning to the middle of October, we're just touching on that 62 or greater. So one of the real-time and per red monitoring studies that we did through California Department of Fish and Wildlife is to actually place temperature and dissolved oxygen probes. We intended to place them directly within the reds to actually see what the eggs are exposed to. We had permitting issues through ESA, so these probes were placed adjacent to, right downstream of these reds. One thing that fish agencies agreed on is that this is a pilot, so we're not to use this data for real-time management because they're not placed exactly right where the eggs are. But you see the various lines. These probes, number 2, 8, and 11, are actual probes within the reds, adjacent to reds, and then the dark blue line is Clear Creek temperature compliance point. So as we expect, Clear Creek is the highest temperature. The number 2 probe is the most upstream red, so we would expect that red to have cooler temperatures and corresponding dissolved oxygen on the lower graph. So it looks like through this survey that dissolved oxygen is not an issue for egg incubation for this year. Next year we plan on installing these probes directly within the reds.
Before they get there.
Yeah. So over the last 12 years, so I need to make a note here that the 2014 number is draft and preliminary, so folks shouldn't hang their hat on the number. But the numbers you see in the red boxes are the numbers of females per year, female spawners, and the bars, how high they go, directly correlate to the number of juveniles that they produced that made it past Red Bluff. So we have Red Bluff rotary screw trap monitoring. You take that number divided by the number of females that made it up and spawned, and these are the numbers that we came up with. Of particular importance, you look at 2011, and that's a really wet water year, good production of the 424 females that we saw in the system. But from there, we see production going considerably lower, from 400, 300 down to less than 200 for this year. And I think that fecundity, number of eggs per females, might fluctuate, but not that much. So what this tells me is that assuming that all these females successfully spawned, that the eggs are dying, juveniles are dying, they don't have the keys to migrate downstream, there might be increased predation, so that there's considerably less juveniles making it past Red Bluff, especially for this year. Oops. How do you go back? With this one?
Sorry.
There you go. So the Fish and Wildlife Service monitors rotary screw traps at Red Bluff Diversion Dam, and they come out with biweekly estimates. So based on what they capture, they estimate and extrapolate to populations. And this graph provides estimates of the population of winter run across multiple years. So as you can see, going down the different colors, which is per year, last year we had the 1.77 million juveniles emigrating past Red Bluff Diversion Dam. There's an asterisk there. There's a government shutdown for the 17 days, so there was an extrapolation of how many fish we think migrated past during the lack of monitoring. But when you look at 2014 to date, and to date was November 4th, we're looking at just a little over 322,000 that made it past Red Bluff so far, in comparison with the year-end estimates of greater than 1 million all the way to 4.4 million in brood year 2009. So this is a continuation of the graph that I showed earlier, and that's temperatures, and this has to do with fall run now. So starting in October, it continues with where we left off in October for the winter run slide. We're starting off with warmer water coming out of Keswick in the red, and by the time we get to Bend Bridge, it's really warm. One of the, in quotes, benefits that fall run have that winter run don't is they spawn farther downstream. And it's not really a benefit earlier in the year in October where it's warmer downstream, but as the temperatures cool down, there's less hours in a day. Starting probably end of October going into November, we're seeing the backward trend. Keswick ends up being the warmest spot as the water temperatures cool down as we go downstream. So this is the same overlay of mortality. Less than 8% at 56 to 58, it starts going up. And 100% mortality at 62 or greater. And again, it's a continuum. So for this year, as far as the monitoring goes, we're seeing, because the Sacramento River and especially the releases out of Keswick were so warm, we're seeing a lot more fish making a left-hand turn into Clear Creek. Oops. Any batteries? Oh well, I'll just talk. So the flow management part of this is relatively the same. It's a it's just a reminder of timing. So winter run primarily May. It's going backwards. So it's just reminding everybody that
Thank you.
that peak spawning is May and June for winter run, and then the last 3 years a little later. So this is the same for flow as temperatures, so there's those concerns that we want to make sure that we address. So there's two different efforts, and huge efforts. Props to California Department of Fish and Wildlife to be able to go out there so frequently. I think Paul mentioned it, that during each of the Keswick release cuts, CDFW staff go out there to monitor the location and the amount of flow over, I don't know if it's all the reds, but they marked various reds that were subject to dewatering. And then they also tracked potential isolation pools. for stranded juvenile winter run especially, but all Chinook salmon, and we're able to rescue those. So here's this one?
Yeah.
Okay, so, well, it's not very clear here, but here's an example of red modification. So the fish
Mhm.
agencies get together, we talk about all the reds that would potentially be dewatered
Mhm.
at various flow releases, and the ones that could be dewatered given any given Keswick release, and at what level of flow. So we take a look at these, and the modification is really removing the rocks off the tops. And this allows for more flow through the reds, and also when the little guys, when the element come up, they don't come up to air, they come up to water. There's only a certain amount of times, and I think it's 2 limit, that we start compromising the construction and integrity of the reds. So that's when we just cry uncle, and we have a warning to reclamation about, don't cut any further, or here's ramification if we do, and then we make these decisions. And then the isolation pulls, here's just an example of what these guys go out there and do, and this is just one pull. I don't know how many there are up and down the river.
Lot, I assume.
So,
Sorry. Back one, yeah.
there we go. So switching over to the American. Okay, next slide. Oh, next slide. Okay, so the American River, the blue line is, so we see August on the x-axis. The blue line is August of 2013. Releases out of Nimbus. So as releases go down to about 1250 all the way through January, and we had the interest, it's the same as the Sacramento River. We want to make sure that there's minimal or no dewatering of reds. So in January, that's when there was an off-ramp of the flow management standard,
Mhm.
which allows for a minimum of 500 CFS out of Nimbus. So we see 500 CFS. I'll talk about these 2 spikes going close to 1,000 CFS. But from the 500 CFS up through April, we skip over to the green line, and that's 2014. So August
Mhm.
1st, and the green line is about 1,500. We are now at the end of the green line in November, about 1,050. And I would say don't pay too much attention to the red line. We're not proposing going down to 500. There's, right now anyway, there's no consideration of off-ramp as to the FMS. But the situation is if we end up off-ramping and we flatline the red at 500, we're in the same situation as we're in last year. Oh, next slide. So this is at Sailor Bar, one of the prime, so I'm switching over to fall run now, but one of the prime spawning areas for fall run. So as you see a gradation from 800 down to 500 CFS, there's more and more areas of that spawning bar that's dewatered. Green represents each of the reds that
Mhm.
were monitored. So at 500 CFS, about 11% of the reds were dewatered. Next slide. So here's the graphical pictures representing what it looks out there. 800 fairly connected, 500 you start seeing these pools.
Mhm.
Concern about isolation of juveniles that are already out of the gravel, and especially the eggs that are still in the gravel.
Right.
Next slide. So Chair Marcus, you mentioned you like bubble charts, so between then and now I threw this together. Not really. Kramer Fish Sciences, contracted by the Water Forum, went out and did a study. So these are certainly not definitive. There's no error bars, but an estimate. So the estimate is that about 24,462 female fall Chinook spawned in the Lower American River this past year. Or past year is 2013, a year ago, leading into 2014. So from those females with an average of 6,001 eggs per female, the fecundity, we come up with 146.8 million Chinook salmon eggs in the gravel. So I was talking about going down to 500 and what happens to the stranded fish, and especially the reds, the eggs that are still under the gravel. So there's an estimate about 11% that I mentioned earlier. That equates to 16.2 million eggs still in the gravel. The first pulse that I mentioned I was going to talk about earlier, the first pulse, February 7th to 9th, there's an estimate in the green, that little piece of the pie, of 4.9 million of those, the 30% that made it out of the gravel. That leaves 70% still in the gravel. What happened to them? There comes the second pulse in March. And it was very important, these pulses, because in consideration of the TOCP requests and the order and the interest of fish agencies and operations through the RT dot, we're able to get these two pulses. And that's a balance between, do we save the water in the reservoirs, do we provide fish flows, and what happens to the constituents that the rest of the uses of the water. So it remains to be seen. We'll never know, but based on the 70% that were still in the gravel, we think there was a big benefit to the March pulse. The unhealthy identified there is about 5 to 25% that were either subjected to lower DO, dissolved oxygen, or higher water temperatures. So the rest of them were healthy. The question now is, did they make it out? And it's still an outstanding question, because I don't think there's that kind of monitoring to identify. Next slide. Well, this was March 6 months ago. Yeah.
So you're giving us an example of what happens.
Yes.
All right.
So the red line that I mentioned earlier, don't focus too much on it,
Yeah.
is if we have another off-ramp year that allows for the 500, we'll be in the same situation of potential dewatering and
Stranding them.
what do we do with the water?
Okay. Got it.
So move up to the, or move down, I guess, to the Delta Cross channel. Want to add anything? No. Okay. So I'll refer to either gates down or the DCC, open or closed. So this is a closed scenario. Next slide. So DCC gate operations, one of the benefits, depending on how we look at it, one of the benefits of the DCC is that there are gates. So we have the option of flexibility of opening or closing for whatever the need is, whether it's fish migration or water quality. For fish benefit, keeping them closed is better. Salmonids stay in the main stem. You see in the green arrow, stay in the main stem, higher survival. Gates open, that would be in the interest of freshening up the delta. So there's all these water quality monitoring stations within the central delta. And Paul, and, the operators can speak to how sensitive these are to concern levels and exceeding water quality standards. But that's one of the big considerations that they have as far as requesting or just opening the DCC. Next slide. But there's a ramification with that. If the DCC is open, there's less outflow. So in the shaded blue, there's other considerations of outflow and other water quality considerations that reclamation and DWR have to balance. Next slide. So one of the questions that DOS, the Delta Operations for Salmonids and Sturgeon, they meet every Tuesday morning to talk about fish location, distribution, timing, magnitude, and potential operational scenarios or concerns. And one of the questions that they ask every week, and every week there's differences of opinion. You get a bunch of fish biologists in the room, and one of the things is I'm glad that they don't reach consensus by the end, because they'll never finish a meeting. But they look at the Red Bluff Diversion Dam Rotary Screw Trap information, Glen Calusa Irrigation District, Tisdale RSTs. They look at all that monitoring data. And they also look at Knight's Landing and the different trawls close to where the DCC is. And they ask themselves, where are the fish? Especially last year when there's so many, everybody's interested in water and fish. So where are they? In an extreme example, one said, well, we haven't seen them past Red Bluff, so maybe half are still upstream of Red Bluff. They haven't made it past. And in that same meeting, another person says, well, I think there's at least half that are in the delta rearing. So these are things we have to grapple with. One of the big things as far as the drought goes, lower flows, clear water. If we don't see a fish in a monitoring location, does that mean they're not there? And that's one of the big things that they haggle with or grapple with. Some folks say the salmonids can see the traps, they avoid them, they're bigger when they come down. Others say no. So it's going to be an ongoing debate even within fish agencies, or fish agencies within DOS. Next slide. So as far as operation of the Delta Cross Channel for December 15th through January 31st, what we ended up doing was the D1641 provides for up to 45 days of gate closure between November 1st and January 31st. The NIMS biological opinion took those 45 days and made that a requirement. Hard closure, December 15th through January 31st. And it was during that time, especially last year, when because of the drought situation and low flows coming down, and that was one of the agreements in the TUCP was
Right.
minimal reservoir releases. How do we freshen up the delta? One way is to open up the DCC, but then if fish go through, that's another issue that we'd have to deal with. As far as DCC gate operations, we monitor, next slide. We monitor fish and catch indices at Knight's Landing Rotary Screw Trap. Next slide. Or hit the button, I guess. Sacramento Beach, Sains, and next slide, and Sacramento Trawl. And there's different metrics. I'm not going to go into all the details of the calculations and everything, but see enough fish and close the DCC.
Right.
Last year we provided flexibility for this hard trigger. So there's an interagency team that developed a Delta Cross Channel gate operations trigger matrix that provides for opening up the Delta Cross Channel if water quality is X and if fish are wherever. You know, there's metrics of where they have to close. Okay, next slide. So in its entirety in water year 2014, the gates were open for 9 days when they otherwise would have been closed, according to our biological opinion. What did that do to the fish? Next slide. To the extent that we understand winter-run migration, and as I mentioned earlier, you can't confirm a negative. So if we don't see a fish in the monitoring, that doesn't mean they didn't show up. But to the extent of our abilities to monitor the fish coming downstream, the pink shading identifies the 9-day window of gate opening. The blue line indicates winter-run migration and detection at those specific monitoring locations close to the DCC. So according to this graph, winter-run migration up to the Delta Cross Channel came after the gates were closed after February 9th. So based on what we know, retrospectively, at the time we had no idea, and I guess we did a good job looking backwards, that we don't think there was an issue with winter-run entrainment through the DCC for those 9 days in 2014. Next slide. Okay, we go to OMR and exports. I didn't know where to fit this, so go ahead, next slide. So I fit it in here. In 2013, our NIMS Southwest Fisheries Science Center started a 3-year study of tagging hatchery winter run, acoustically tagging hatchery winter run, and setting them out at Caldwell Park in Reading and monitoring the various locations and survival of the hatchery winter run coming downstream in and through the delta. That continued in 2014, and we're going to have another release in 2015. And this is a compilation of the survival of all those tagged fish. So you see the ends. In 2013 it was 148, 2014 it was 358. But you see the drops in survival, probably just in general in the mid-sac, and then survival goes up again, and then it goes down where we start entering the delta at Freeport. Next slide. So I'm not sure how that slide fits in, but like I said, I wanted to fit it in somewhere. So going back 2 slides, well, no, I take that back. So we're talking about flexibilities, temporary urgency changes, and orders provided. So one of the flexibilities that NIMS provided was we have an OMR requirement, Action 4.2.3, that limits export or limits OMR to no more negative than 5,000 CFS. on a 14-day average, with no more negative, with a grace period, I guess, of a 5-day average, no more negative than 25% more negative than that.
Right.
So on a 5-day, they can go up to negative 6250, 14-day limit at 5,000. In order to assist in operations, capture the storm events, and abandoned water, I guess, is characterized in the delta, we provided this flexibility. Operationally, Reclamation and DWR provided specific OMRs and anticipated exports through March. So we granted the flexibility of going more negative than the negative 5,000 on a 14-day average for a certain amount of time, and it turned out to be 7 days, with a compensatory more positive based on the specific OMRs provided by the end of the month in March. So what we see in this graph, these kind of graphs are distributed to DOS every week. So this is an example of what DOS looks at. You see the red on the top. The red indicates loss of older juveniles that includes winter run Chinook salmon. The yellow shading are the 7 days where we allow the flexibility of the OMR being more negative than negative 5,000 on a 14-day average. So you see it kind of corresponds where we have more negative OMR, we have an increase, and actually the increase is from 0, increase of loss of older juvenile winter run or older juvenile Chinook salmon. Mike mentioned in the delta smelt entrainment portion that this is attributable, and he was talking about delta smelt, attributable to the geographic distribution of fish. So one of the questions, if the fish aren't there, then what happens to them when we have more negative OMR? So were the fish there beforehand, and did they show up because the OMR went more negative? This year, going back a bunch of slides, we're looking at 322,000 as opposed to over 1 million and 4 million coming down from Red Bluff. So now you have considerably less fish making it down to the delta, we think. So how many fish would be exposed? And that's one of the sensitivities and the struggles that we're going to have in consideration of operations and protecting fish.
Okay.
Next slide. So put it into a table, and this is what we come up with. On the left, aside from the dates, the left 3 columns are USGS gauged OMR at the daily, 5-day, and 14-day average. The next 3 columns are using an OMR index at the daily, 5-day, and 14-day. The shading, the green, blue, and yellow shading indicates all of the days that the OMR index, calculated OMR, was more negative than negative 5,000. Now, our biological opinion allows for more negative for the daily. Actually, it doesn't even consider daily. The 5-day allows up to negative 6250, but at a 5-day. So while implementing the OMR piece on a 5-day, operationally, the OMR needs to be more positive to compensate for that. But when you look at the 5-day here, there's a stretch of, I don't know how many days that is, 10 or 12 days. With the corresponding 14-day, that's more negative. So the first yellow that you see on March 15th is the 14-day average that leads up to the negative 5250. That corresponds to the previous 14 days. So previous 14 days goes to approximately March 1st or March 2nd. Now if you skip over one column to the right, you see the pink shading. For the whole water year starting October 1st, 2013, there was no loss of older juveniles until the pink shading, which corresponds to part of that 14-day average. Is that because of OMRs and exports? You know, people can speculate whatever they want, but this is the data that we have. On the right column is steelhead salvage or loss. Another thing that, whether it's coincidence or whether it has to do with negative OMRs, I don't know. But when you go past the yellow, down to the rest of the month, the OMR start being a little more positive, less negative on a 14-day average, but you still see loss of older juveniles for another week or so. Next slide. I put this up because it's on the web, Delta Science Program website. Jeff Stewart and my staff provided what I've just been calling a retrospective analysis. How did fish, primarily winter run, fare with drought and operations over 2014? So he's got like a 40-slide presentation going down the details of what happened. This was presented as part of the annual review from last week. So in a nutshell, I stole his thunder, and I have some summaries taken from his 2 slides at the end. So one of the big deals as far as trying to figure out how many fish we're talking about. In a previous slide, we were talking about the 322,000 for this year. Last year, the estimate from Red Bluff is about 1.8 million. But using our JPE, juvenile production estimate, is how we identify or calculate the amount of take at the pumps. We estimated about 4 million. So what happened between the 1.8 and the 4? Is there an error in calculation? Is there more mortality that we didn't anticipate? But a twofold difference ends up being a lot when we're talking about managing for the species in the delta. One thing that this drought assessment team, so I guess I need to qualify or clarify that Jeff Stewart and my staff, NIMS, presented, but it was an interagency team of the 5 agencies that came up with this whole presentation. They identified or indicated that the winter run reared longer in the upper river. They were probably waiting for flow queues to come down, which pretty much didn't happen. So rearing longer in the upper river, and there's more smolts that came past Red Bluff than typical. Typically, there's more young of year that come down and rear in the middle, the mid-Sacramento River. Late precipitation events did key in to winter run migration. So those slides that I was talking about survival, there was higher survival in the mid-Sacramento, probably because the juveniles keyed into the pulse flows and migrated faster downstream. There's all kinds of stuff in that presentation, so I encourage you guys to look at that. The window, in quotes, the window of opportunity for salvage was shorter last year. And anybody can speculate as to why. Was there less exports, more positive OMRs? There's just less fish in the system. All those are fair game as far as speculation. And then, as I mentioned in this previous slide, that there was more loss of older juveniles and steelhead when the OMRs were more negative. Next slide. So,
Great.
Mike, you want to talk about take-home messages for smelt?
Sure. And the take-home from my portion of this presentation is pretty simple. One, that this is a work in progress, so we've given you what we can today, but there will be more later. And I just also want to emphasize that we've also been tracking drought effects in other areas. As I said, there were hatchery issues with hatchery operations that were drought related, and we also had substantial effects to the refuge system due to drought, which we can address later. The second take-home message is that keeping the smelt on the Sacramento River side of the estuary is helpful. As we saw in 2014, when that happens, no entrainment or very low entrainment. So the effects that we saw this past year are almost certainly attributable to the dry conditions and issues that are unrelated to water project operations.
So just to follow up on that, relative to the smelt, there's a lot of work that was done looking at water quality issues as part of the drought monitoring program to evaluate their effects on habitat quality, which are probably the drivers for delta smelt success this year. And those data are still being collected and evaluated. They look at macrocystis, other water quality factors, submerged aquatic vegetation and that type of thing. So that information will be coming available probably after the first of the year. And that type of work is going to be continued through the 2015 year in expectation, of drought conditions or evaluating the effects of improved flows.
So in general, the third bullet, better temperature management is needed on the Sacramento River. One of the situations that happened out of Shasta, 1.9 million acre feet carryover storage at the end of September 2013. Going into 2014 temperature management season, as far as I understand, the upper gates were inaccessible in terms of releasing warmer water from the top balanced with cooler water down below for temperature management. So I don't know if we characterize it as wasted, but maybe more cold water was released than necessary to meet the 56 degrees earlier on in the season that could
Interesting.
have.
Oh, good point.
Better temperature management, we've identified, especially in August, end of August, there was a forecast and temperature projection that came out from Reclamation as part of the Sac River Temperature Task Group. And the day that we received it, we knew that releases out of Keswick were 4 degrees warmer than depicted in the graphs. So if we're going to use any kind of projections, forecasts, and things like that, we need to just tighten up those estimates.
So the Keswick, I always assume part of the problem with temperature is just how much you had to release into the Klamath, but no.
No.
It's also just that Keswick, the estimate on Keswick was wrong.
Well, I would defer to the operations side of the fence, but as far as the Klamath goes, that's how much water comes over
Okay.
through Spring Creek.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, no, just the issue of temperature management, I didn't realize it was just that the estimate of temperature at Keswick was off as being a key variable.
Yeah, and I'm not sure I follow exactly what was meant by it's off. If it's, we have to try to figure out what it's compared to observe versus which model run and things and everything that goes into model run.
Well, just clearly, these are things
but
that are
it's-
important in coming up with the drought
There's a lot of
operations
things
plan.
There's a lot of things that affect the temperature modeling. It's not only the releases, but the released water coming out of the Shasta Reservoir, ambient air temperatures. and
Right, air temperature.
a number of-
So the fourth bullet I mentioned earlier, that in between Keswick release reductions, CDFW staff go out there and monitor reds, locations, potential dewatering, and stranding. So continuing with that, so we have a better real-time idea of what's going on with the eggs as far as the probes goes, and also with potential stranding. The DCC gate operations trigger table, we would say, in quotes, worked. We opened up the DCC when it otherwise would have been closed for the 9 days, and we didn't see a noticeable increase in winter run entrainment through the Delta Cross channel. I wouldn't say the trigger table works because of that, because there's all kinds of scenarios and conditions that were provided in the trigger table. I wouldn't suggest we continue with the drought to test it, but if conditions prevail, I think the table is intact enough that it wouldn't warrant big changes for us to test again. And then earlier, I think it was John that mentioned about 400,000 acre feet of water conserved over the year. That's a big deal. Where was it conserved? If it was in Shasta, end of September was about 1.1 million acre feet. So 400,000 would have been a third of that reservoir. So I'll leave you with that.
I think, I'm glad you highlighted this, though. I think it's worth folks, considering that the fishery agencies, the operational agencies, and all of us with the TUCP, we took a risk, and then we figured out a way to manage the risk in terms of coming up with tools like the trigger table, and then working within, trying to create flexibility to respond to the situation. So, yeah, it worked in this instance. It needs refinements, but, I just commend everyone for rolling up their sleeves. It took a lot of effort, and I remember that when that was happening earlier this year, and so it's good to hear a detailed presentation on that. One thing you were just talking about, the temperature management. So I think in terms of what dials can we turn, we've talked a lot today about the natural factors we don't have control over. But you mentioned the gate and the ability to blend warmer water with colder water to, and maybe looking ahead for this coming year. Are there physical repairs that are needed? Is that a lost cause? Because for a civil engineer, I'm interested in what needs to be built or repaired or manufactured to prepare for a potential very dry year ahead of us. Yeah.
There are known gaps within the temperature control device at Shasta. I think years ago they closed up the ones that were easily done. I think they actually did some more surveys and did an inspection a few weeks ago, and I haven't heard the results from that. So we will be able to assess the condition of the temperature control device further. I know we're working on some potential improvements, and probably won't get it done for this year, but temperature curtains or a curtain in Whiskeytown Reservoir, that will improve efficiency of the operations there. But we're evaluating a few different things we can work on.
So this goes to Mr. Lehigh's presentation. So it's been a while since we saw those slides, but there were a couple of the early slides that have the charts as to actions and what's controlling. I found those rather useful, and I'm just wondering if, and maybe you have this on the slides. My eyes just aren't very good, so it's hard to see the detail. But to include information on what is controlling, whether it's biological opinion, D1641. I suppose there are instances where it's both, and so it might be a little difficult, but to the extent that you could provide that information in future presentations, I think it'd be helpful.
Okay, yeah, I think we can do that. I spoke just, kind of verbally to some of them what was controlling, but yeah, we can certainly do that. And as you indicate, sometimes it's a little fuzzy exactly which. It's a combination of standards that would be controlling, but we can try to provide that in future.
Okay, I thought they were very good charts. And then as to, for NOAA, on the mortality, the slides that you had on mortality, 100% mortality, I'm assuming that that does not involve any releases for temperature. Those are just conditions.
Water releases
Right.
and cold water releases. Earlier, either John or Paul were talking about how there's just no more cold water in Shasta. So it's just monitoring the temperatures that are coming out, and what can we do?
Okay, thank you.
One of the
I think
oh, go ahead.
that just highlighted the problem that we ran into at the end of the year, in that there wasn't enough, the ability to release cold water, and between that and water temperatures, we just saw high mortality conditions for eggs and larvae in the gravel due to temperature.
Yeah, and that was part of that whole risk management scenario. It was interesting, though, that the insight, it's there was the idealized graph that you showed in terms of when the bulk of the potential, the population that would be exposed to the temperature had potentially passed through. And I remember when we met in October, first week of October, and we were all on pins and needles about the temperatures that Winter Run were being exposed to. But going back to that graph, it seems, there was some mitigation. I mean, you weren't able to get the low temperatures to stretch on through October, the home stretch, but it looked like the home stretch doesn't have as large of an impact on the overall population. Not to say it wasn't serious, but at least temperature management got us to that point. Is that right, Mr. Yep? I mean, it appears that we hit a mortality threshold, but it wasn't the bulk of the normal curve had passed through the system at that point.
I would say temperature management didn't necessarily get us through because there just wasn't any more cold water.
Right, but the exposed population
Yeah, at the time
wasn't the majority of the population at that point.
At the time, we were struggling with no more cold water. So do we just write off the reds that are still in the gravel
The end of the tail of the
Correct.
Gaussian curve.
and,
yeah.
and reduce releases for the benefit of the storage? And we felt, well, even if it's warmer water, there's going to be zero survival if the eggs are dry
Yeah.
or juveniles still in the reds. So we asked reclamation to maintain a certain amount of releases and then did some mitigation in terms of pulling rocks off the reds and stuff, just to try to save some of those.
It's amazing.
And it
You're
highlights
actually
just this-
plucking rocks off the red.
Yeah, it's the real-time management. So I just want to really emphasize
One-
that y'all were paying attention, daily in terms of what was going on and
One
the
of-
type of management response.
One other thing, I was talking about the easy math of 80 days. Those 80 days are just standard application of temperature units, but when we applied those 80 days to reality and reclamation, and it's in our interest also to maintain more cold or more reservoir storage. So we would also have the interest of reducing releases, but not at the risk of winter and ready watering. So we took a look at the 80 days and we came up with what we think, as the temperatures are warming up, there's actually increased metabolism and increased growth, increased hatching of the eggs, up to a certain point where we start seeing mortality. So we ended up thinking that the 80 days would be 74 days later in the season. So as you see that curve of how many eggs and how many, well, especially the juveniles are still in the gravel, it's actually less. So there's less of an impact because of that consideration.
But overall, the story's not good. There was
Right.
much mortality. The numbers were lower. And so the drought had a significant impact, it appears, on winter run Chinook.
Right, and so it doesn't look good for the drought operations planning for next year if we have another incredibly dry year. And I know that you all are struggling now to do that and come up with options and scenarios, and I know it's due January 15th, but I know there's a draft that you all are working on that you want to have out and working with stakeholders. What's the nature of the timing on that?
Well, so the agencies are putting together kind of a broader document is a strategy document looking at 2015, and the drought contingency plan is one component of that strategy. So yeah, we're currently working through a draft of that strategy. Like you've indicated, we have a lot of work to do between now and January 15th as far as working through all of these issues in the dry, because we're lower storage-wise going into this year than we were coming into the last
Right.
year.
Snowpack's not pretty either.
You know, there's still a lot of hope still this year because we're very early in the year. But those drier scenarios that we'll be evaluating are the ones that are going to be some real tough choices to be made on all of these trade-offs, because absolutely, any management decision we make, there will be trade-offs between all of these beneficial
Okay.
uses. So,
And they'll be ugly.
And they will be ugly, yes.
But what's the timing? I had thought it might have been out by now. It's just me, maybe I'm behind, but just to when to expect it, because what we were going to engage with stakeholders on it, not necessarily through this process, you'll be reporting on it through this process, but what's the latest?
I will turn to my colleagues here and see if I don't have the exact timing. If you're talking about the strategy document, or?
Yeah, whatever we're going to send out we're going to discuss with stakeholders so that they give us engagement and help us think of better ways to do it, which they did last year.
I believe we were looking at something closer, maybe Russ.
right here. Is the microphone on?
Yeah,
Good morning.
Morning.
Russ Stein with DWR, Assistant Deputy Director. Yes, we are diligently working on a 2015 strategy document with the federal agencies. And our goal is to actually have a working session Thursday and Friday to put
Great.
some fine tuning to that document.
great.
And then the goal would be for our directors to then go to the stakeholder groups and let them know what's in that.
So sometime in the next couple of weeks, perhaps?
Yes.
Okay, that's all I was looking for.
Okay,
Just
thank you.
for everyone listening, because we've talked about it, and so I didn't want to leave it just unsaid.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
All right, well, if there are any other questions, thank you. I know we asked for this fuller briefing, and I do appreciate it. As with anything, it's complex and reality-based, and therefore raises a lot of questions versus answering a lot of them. But thank you for all the work that you've done collectively across the agencies, and we'll just look forward to continuing to work with you. Anything else? All right. Here's my suggestion. Sorry we didn't take a mid-morning break, even though I said we would. I thought this would have been shorter, but we asked for it and it was important and educational. So my suggestion, and this may mean that some of my colleagues miss some of the meeting, and I don't know how to, maybe you all can help them coordinate in a way, unless we can do it now. Are other people needing to take a long lunch or go to lunch? Because otherwise, I'd like to just take a half-hour break, if it's okay, or come back at 12:30, because we have a very heavy agenda before us, and I'd like to be done tonight sometime before, so people can get home. Okay, so we'll come back at 12:30.